Shadows of strength. The night was heavy with the hum of the city, a faint buzz that faded as Tasha Owens walked deeper into the dimly lit industrial district. Her steps echoed softly against the cracked concrete streets, the neon glow of the occasional street lamp reflecting off her black hoodie. She kept her pace measured, her breathing calm, as she approached the old warehouse that had become her sanctuary. Inside, the world changed. The air was colder, the silence deeper. Dust motes danced in the faint streams of light seeping through the broken windows. Rusty machinery loomed like forgotten giants, and the scent of oil and decay lingered in the corners. It was far from inviting, but Tasha had chosen this place for its solitude. Here she could train uninterrupted, away from prying eyes and the pressures of a world that often judged her for her skin and her strength. She slipped off her hoodie, revealing a fitted athletic tank and a lean, muscular frame. Tasha had spent years refining her body and mind. She wasn't just a martial artist. She was a warrior, a former intelligence operative who had endured battles far more dangerous than most could imagine. Now, away from that life, she poured her energy into self-discipline, channeling the frustrations of her daily existence into movements that were both deliberate and powerful. Tonight, her instincts buzzed louder than usual. As she moved through her warm-up, her muscles stretched and coiled with precision, her body on autopilot. Yet her mind was elsewhere, scanning the room, the faintest of sounds, and the shadows that didn't sit right. The sensation was subtle, a prickle on the back of her neck, but Tasha had learned to trust such feelings. "Someone's here," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the faint creaks of the warehouse settling. She slowed her movements, her breath steady as she turned her focus outward. Years of training had taught her to become the predator when a threat was near, to control fear and wield it as a weapon. Outside, Officer Kyle Stevens sat in his squad car, chewing on the last remnants of a cold sandwich. His patrol had been uneventful, the same routine of checking alleyways and shooing off loiterers. When his headlights had caught a silhouette slipping into the warehouse, his curiosity, and something darker, was piqued. The warehouse had been abandoned for years. Teenagers, drifters, and small-time criminals occasionally used it for cover, and Stevens relished these opportunities to assert his authority. He straightened in his seat, adjusting his uniform as he grabbed his flashlight. Tonight, it wasn't about crime. It was about control. The shadowy figure had moved too confidently, too assuredly, and that bothered him. He wanted to remind whoever it was that he was the law here. As Stevens entered the building, his heavy boots announced his arrival with deliberate thuds. He liked the sound, the echo of his power filling the empty space. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on Tasha mid-stretch. "Evening," he called out, his tone laced with feigned politeness, but undercut by an edge of condescension. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Tasha turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Her sharp brown eyes locked on his, assessing. "Just training," she said simply, her voice steady and calm. "In an abandoned building?" Stevens asked, his skepticism thinly veiled. He let the flashlight beam linger on her face a moment longer than necessary. "Kind of an odd place for a workout." "I like the quiet," Tasha replied, tilting her head slightly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Stevens didn't like the way she said that. Calm, measured, unflinching. He wasn't used to being met with such composure. Most people scrambled to explain themselves or offered apologies. This woman didn't even blink. He stepped closer, letting his flashlight drop to his side, but keeping his posture tall and imposing. "This area isn't exactly safe," he said, his voice dipping lower, "especially for someone like you. Things happen in places like this." Tasha caught the undertone, the unspoken threat wrapped in his words. She stayed still, her hands at her sides, every muscle ready. "I can take care of myself," she said, her tone neutral but firm. Stevens let out a harsh chuckle, stepping closer still. "You think so? Look, lady, I'm trying to be nice here. Maybe you should move along before things get complicated. Her patience thinned. Tasha straightened, the movement small but deliberate, her presence suddenly larger. If I'm not breaking the law, I don't see why my presence here concerns you. Stevens's eyes narrowed, his irritation flaring. This wasn't going the way he expected. He was used to people backing down, cowering under his authority. Instead, she was meeting him head-on, her calmness unnerving. "Listen," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm not gonna ask again. Either you leave, or I'll make you." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. Tasha held her ground, her instincts screaming that this man was dangerous, that he was teetering on the edge of losing control. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer," she said, her voice even. "But I won't be intimidated, either." The word struck Stevens like a slap. His jaw tightened, and his hand hovered near his baton. Tasha noticed the shift, her eyes narrowing. She had seen this before, a man so desperate to prove his dominance that he'd cross lines he shouldn't. "Final warning," Stevens growled, his hand moving to grip his baton. "Move." Tasha exhaled, her muscles tensing. "No." The single word hung in the air, defiant and immovable. It was a spark, igniting the simmering anger in Stevens. He swung his baton, fast and wild, aiming for her shoulder. But Tasha wasn't there. She moved with lightning speed, her body twisting out of the way. The baton sliced through empty air. Before Stevens could recover, Tasha stepped in, her hand darting out to grab his wrist. With a practiced twist, she disarmed him, the baton clattering to the floor. Stevens staggered back, his face flushing with shock and rage. Tasha stood her ground, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed on him. "You don't want to do this," she said, her voice low and firm. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Stevens, humiliated and trembling with fury, clenched his fists, his mind racing for a way to regain control. But the look in Tasha's eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger or fear. It was something far more unsettling. It was pity. And it cut deeper than any strike ever could. The breaking point. The baton lay between them, a silent challenge, its clatter still echoing faintly through the cavernous warehouse. Tasha stood poised, her body balanced like a coiled spring, ready to react to whatever Officer Kyle Stevens decided to do next. Her gaze never wavered, locked on his face, where fury and disbelief danced a volatile tango. Stevens's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them into fists, his humiliation radiating from him like heat. He wasn't just angry, he was unraveling. Tasha could see it in the twitch of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. Men like him didn't handle defiance well, especially from a woman. Especially from someone they underestimated. "You think you've won, don't you?" Stevens spat, his voice low and venomous, each word dripping with bitter resentment. He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the gritty floor, his body language screaming a need to reclaim the upper hand. Tasha didn't move, her calmness a stark contrast to his growing agitation. "This isn't about winning," she replied, her voice measured, steady. "It's about you recognizing that you're escalating something that doesn't need to go any further." Her words only seemed to fuel the fire burning within him. His face flushed red, the veins in his neck bulging as he glared at her. "Don't lecture me," he snapped, pointing an accusing finger at her. "You don't get to stand there and tell me how to do my job." Tasha allowed herself a small sigh, her breath steadying her, keeping her anger in check. "And what is your job, exactly? Protecting people or harassing them because they don't fit your narrative?" That did it. Stevens's face twisted into a snarl, his pride stung in a way that made rational thought impossible. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder, his movements wild and uncoordinated, fueled by rage rather than strategy. Tasha moved instinctively. She sidestepped his advance with ease, her body pivoting gracefully as she used his own momentum against him. With a swift movement, she hooked her arm around his, twisting him off balance. Stevens stumbled, his footing slipping on the gritty floor as he hit the ground hard, his breath escaping in a sharp grunt. He scrambled to his feet quickly, but the impact had rattled him, both physically and mentally. His chest heaved with labored breaths, and his eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to give him an edge. "You don't want to keep doing this," Tasha said, her voice low but firm. "You're not thinking clearly, and you're going to make a mistake you can't take back." Her calmness only infuriated him further. He wasn't used to being challenged, wasn't used to someone standing their ground and matching his aggression with composure. It threw him off balance, leaving him floundering in unfamiliar territory. "I'll decide what mistakes I make," he snarled, his hand reaching for his radio. "You think you're untouchable. I'll call this in, and we'll see how tough you are when backup arrives." Tasha didn't move, her expression unreadable. "Go ahead," she said, her tone neutral. "Call for backup. But think about what you're really calling them into. You're not the victim here, and they'll see that." For a moment, Stevens hesitated, his thumb hovering over the button on the radio. Her words struck something in him, a crack in the armor he wore so tightly. What if she was right? What if his colleagues saw through the narrative he tried to spin? But the doubt only lasted a second before his pride roared back to life, drowning out reason. "This is Officer Stevens requesting immediate backup at the old warehouse on 14th Street. He barked into the radio, his voice shaking slightly but still firm enough to carry authority. "Trespasser is uncooperative and aggressive." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them, but he clung to them like a lifeline. He needed to regain control, to reassert his authority, even if it meant bending the truth to fit his narrative. Tasha crossed her arms, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "Aggressive. You're the one who swung first. You're the one who's out of control." Stevens ignored her, his attention focused on the faint crackle of static from his radio. The silence that followed stretched long enough to make his stomach twist. No immediate response. His backup wasn't as close as he'd hoped. "You can still walk away," Tasha said, her tone softer now, but no less firm. "You can de-escalate this, and we both move on. No one gets hurt. No one has to face the consequences of a bad decision." Her words carried a weight that Stevens couldn't ignore, but his pride was too deeply wounded to let him back down. He was too far in now, and the thought of retreating felt like admitting defeat, a concept he couldn't stomach. Instead, he squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening as he stared her down. "You think you're in control here?" he asked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You think you can stand there and tell me what to do?" Tasha's gaze didn't waver. "I think you're a man who's letting his ego drive his actions," she said simply. "And that's dangerous, for both of us." The truth in her words hit him harder than he wanted to admit, but instead of reflecting, he lashed out, his voice rising. "Shut up. You don't know anything about me." Tasha's eyes softened, a flicker of empathy breaking through her otherwise stoic expression. "I know enough," she said quietly. "I know you're better than this." Her words stopped him cold, the unexpected kindness cutting through his anger like a knife. For a moment, he faltered, his grip on his rage loosening just enough for doubt to creep in. But then the faint crackle of his radio interrupted the silence, and a voice came through. "Stevens, this is dispatch. Confirm location and situation." He grabbed the radio, his hand shaking slightly as he lifted it to his mouth. But before he could respond, Tasha spoke again, her voice calm but commanding. "You don't have to do this." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Stevens hesitated. His grip on the radio slackened, his mind racing as the weight of the situation bore down on him. Tasha didn't move, didn't press him further. She simply waited, her presence a quiet challenge that forced him to confront himself. For the first time, Kyle Stevens felt the cracks in his resolve widen, the fragile facade he had built around his authority crumbling under the pressure of her unyielding strength. And in that moment, he realized he was no longer in control, not of her, and not of himself. The unraveling. The warehouse was thick with tension, every shadow seeming to stretch and deepen in the silence between them. The air felt charged, like the moments before a storm, heavy with the weight of choices not yet made. Officer Kyle Stevens stood frozen, the radio still clutched in his hand, his knuckles white from the force of his grip. He hadn't responded to dispatch's inquiry yet, and the silence on his end seemed to amplify the voice in his head whispering doubts. Tasha stood across from him, her posture calm but alert, every muscle in her body coiled and ready. Her presence was unyielding, her gaze steady, like a mirror reflecting his anger and frustration back at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet strength that unnerved him in ways he couldn't articulate. "You don't have to do this, Stevens," she said again, her voice soft but firm, like a parent trying to reason with a child on the verge of a tantrum. "You still have a choice. Walk away, walk away." The words echoed in his mind, taunting him. They sounded so simple, so rational. But to Stevens, walking away felt like surrender, like admitting he had no control over the situation. And control was the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Not here, not now, not to her. His pride burned hot in his chest, a roaring fire that demanded action. He clicked the radio's button, his voice shaky as he spoke. "This is Stevens. Trespasser is still uncooperative. Requesting backup at the warehouse on 14th Street. Over." The response came quickly, a voice crackling through the static. "Copy that. Stevens, units are en route. ETA, 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It wasn't the immediate reinforcement he'd hoped for, but it was enough to give him a sliver of confidence. Backup was coming, and when they arrived, he'd make sure this woman understood who held the power here. Tasha tilted her head slightly, her sharp brown eyes narrowing as she studied him. 10 minutes, she said, her voice a quiet echo of the dispatch. "A lot can happen in 10 minutes, officer." Her words weren't a threat, but they unsettled him all the same. Stevens tightened his grip on his baton, his jaw clenching as he fought to regain the upper hand. "And you do well to remember that," he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "When backup gets here, you're going to regret your attitude." Tasha sighed softly, shaking her head. "You're not listening. This isn't about me, Stevens. This is about you and the choices you're making." "Don't patronize me," he growled, his anger flaring anew. "You think you're better than me. You think you can just stand there and—" "I think," Tasha interrupted, her voice cutting through his tirade like a blade, "that you're scared. And I think that's why you're lashing out." The words hit Stevens like a punch to the gut. He stumbled back a step, his breath hitching as he struggled to process the accusation. "I'm not scared," he snapped, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "I'm doing my job." "Are you?" Tasha countered, her tone unwavering. "Or are you trying to prove something to yourself?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Stevens felt a cold sweat break out on his brow as he struggled to maintain his composure. She wasn't supposed to be like this. Calm, rational, unafraid. She was supposed to cower, to apologize, to make it easy for him to feel in control. But instead, she was forcing him to confront parts of himself he didn't want to face. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said finally, his voice low and defensive. "You don't know me." "You're right," Tasha replied. "I don't. But I've seen men like you before. Men who think the badge gives them power over everyone else. Men who confuse authority with control." Stevens's hand shook, his fingers tightening around the baton, until his knuckles turned white. "Shut up," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know anything." Tasha took a step closer, her movements deliberate but non-threatening. "I know that you're better than this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know that deep down, you don't want to be the man who lets his anger dictate his actions." "Stop," Stevens snapped, his voice rising. "Just stop." But Tasha didn't stop. She kept her gaze locked on his, her voice steady as she continued. You called for backup, but what happens when they get here? What are you going to tell them? That you couldn't handle one unarmed woman. That you let your pride get the better of you. The questions cut deeper than Stevens wanted to admit. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if she were peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed facade and revealing the raw, insecure man underneath. He hated her for it, hated her calmness, her composure, her refusal to play the role he wanted her to play. You think you're so smart, he spat, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. You think you've got me all figured out. I don't need to have you figured out, Tasha replied. I just need you to see that this isn't about me. This is about you and the choices you're making. Her words struck a nerve, and Stevens felt the anger bubbling inside him threaten to spill over. He wanted to yell, to lash out, to do something that would wipe that calm, knowing expression off her face. But something in her eyes stopped him, a quiet strength that refused to be intimidated, a mirror reflecting the worst parts of himself. For a moment, the warehouse was silent, save for the distant hum of the city outside. Stevens stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind racing as he grappled with the storm of emotions swirling inside him. And Tasha stood across from him, calm and unyielding, waiting for him to decide which path he would take. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. And in that silence, Stevens realized that he was standing on a precipice, teetering between the man he wanted to be and the man he was becoming. A test of will. The sound of distant sirens pierced the heavy silence of the warehouse, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Officer Stevens stood frozen, his baton still clenched in his fist, his mind racing as he struggled to process the situation he had escalated to this point. The crackling tension between him and Tasha Owens had reached a fever pitch, and now the impending arrival of backup felt like a countdown to something he couldn't control. Tasha stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her posture relaxed yet alert. Her calm presence was unshakable, and it only seemed to amplify the storm raging within Stevens. She wasn't moving, wasn't retreating, and wasn't giving him the satisfaction of fear. Instead, her sharp eyes bore into him, unyielding, as if challenging him to confront the truth he was so desperate to avoid. I warned you, Stevens growled, his voice tinged with both desperation and frustration. Backup's coming. This ends here. Tasha tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Does it? She asked, her voice steady, almost soothing. Or is this just the beginning? Her words hit him harder than he expected. Cutting through the bluster and bravado he wore like armor. He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the baton, as he fought to hold on to the semblance of authority he felt slipping away. You've got no idea what you're messing with, he said, his voice rising. When they get here, they'll see you for what you are, a troublemaker who doesn't know her place. Tasha's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile, though it wasn't one of amusement. It was a smile of understanding, of someone who had seen through his facade and knew exactly what drove him. And what place is that, Officer Stevens? She asked. Where do you think I belong? The question stopped him cold. It wasn't what he had expected, and it forced him to confront the unspoken assumptions behind his actions. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening as he realized he didn't have an answer, at least not one he could say out loud. You're twisting this, he said finally, his voice defensive. I'm just doing my job. Are you? Tasha replied, her voice soft yet firm. Or are you using your job to justify something deeper, something you don't want to admit? The accusation stung, and Stevens felt his composure cracking further. He was teetering on the edge, his anger and insecurity threatening to overwhelm him. The sound of the sirens drew closer, a reminder that time was running out. Enough of this, he snapped, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. I don't need to explain myself to you. Tasha nodded slowly, as if she had expected that response. "No, you don't," she said. "But maybe you should explain yourself to the person you see in the mirror. Because that's who you're really fighting right now, not me." Her words were like a mirror, reflecting the parts of himself Stevens had spent years trying to ignore. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and it made his anger flare even hotter. He raised the baton slightly, his hand trembling as he pointed it at her. "Stop talking," he hissed. "Just stop." Tasha didn't flinch. She didn't back away. Instead, she took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Why?" she asked, her voice calm. "Because I'm saying things you don't want to hear. Because I'm forcing you to face the truth." The truth. The word lingered in the air like a challenge, daring Stevens to acknowledge it. He took a shaky breath, his chest heaving as he tried to steady himself. The baton in his hand felt heavier than it should, a symbol of the authority he was clinging to like a lifeline. "I'm not the problem here," he said finally, his voice defensive. "You are. You're the one, whoa." "Who what?" Tasha interrupted, her tone firm but not unkind. "Who didn't cower in fear? Who didn't bow to your authority? Is that what bothers you, Stevens?" The question cut through him like a knife, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. His grip on the baton slackened, his arm dropping slightly as he struggled to find the words to defend himself. But nothing came. He was standing in front of her, exposed, and he hated it. The sirens were louder now, the wail echoing through the empty streets outside the warehouse. Stevens knew his colleagues would be here any moment, and the weight of what he'd done, or failed to do, was pressing down on him like a physical force. "You can still fix this," Tasha said, her voice softer now, almost gentle. "You can choose a different path. You don't have to let this define you." Her words were a lifeline, a chance for him to step back from the edge. But Stevens's pride wouldn't let him reach for it. Instead, he straightened his back, forcing himself to look her in the eye. "I don't need fixing," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "I'm in control here." Tasha didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. And in that silence, Stevens felt the weight of her presence, the quiet strength that had been shaking his foundation since the moment she refused to back down. The sound of tires screeching outside signaled the arrival of backup. Stevens exhaled sharply, relief mingling with dread, as he turned toward the door. He could hear the voices of his fellow officers, their radios crackling as they approached the building. "This is over," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to her or to himself. Tasha's voice stopped him in his tracks. "It's only over if you let it be," she said. "But if you keep walking this path, you're going to lose more than you realize." Stevens paused, his hand tightening around the baton once more, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he took another step toward the door, his chest tightening as he prepared to face his colleagues and the consequences of everything that had unfolded. Behind him, Tasha stood alone in the center of the warehouse, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to follow him or fight him. She had already won the battle that mattered most, the battle for her own dignity, her own truth. And deep down, Stevens knew it too. The arrival. The low hum of engines outside the warehouse signaled the arrival of backup. Blue and red lights flashed through the broken windows, bathing the dim interior in a kaleidoscope of urgency. Officer Kyle Stevens stood near the door, his back to Tasha, every muscle in his body taut as he braced himself for the arrival of his colleagues. He wanted to feel relief, to feel like he was back in control now that reinforcements had come, but all he felt was dread. Behind him, Tasha remained in the center of the warehouse, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. She watched him, not with fear, but with a quiet understanding that unnerved him more than any act of defiance ever could. She had said her piece, laid bare the truths he didn't want to face, and now the weight of those truths pressed down on him like a vice. The first officer to enter was Sergeant Lisa Moore, her short, no-nonsense frame cutting through the doorway with practiced authority. Her sharp eyes quickly scanned the scene, taking in Stevens's stiff posture, the tension in his face, and the calm figure of Tasha standing further inside. Behind Moore, two younger officers followed, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution as they surveyed the room. "Stevens," Moore said, her voice brisk and authoritative. "What's the situation?" Stevens turned, his face flushed, and gestured vaguely toward Tasha. "Trespasser. Uncooperative," he said, his voice rough, the words tumbling out in a way that even he knew sounded weak. Moore's gaze shifted to Tasha, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the woman's calm demeanor, her steady breathing, and the lack of any visible aggression. Something about the scene didn't add up, and Moore's instincts were rarely wrong. "Trespasser, huh?" Moore said, her tone skeptical. She stepped further into the warehouse, her boots echoing softly against the concrete floor. "Ma'am, can you explain what you're doing here?" Tasha met Moore's gaze, her voice calm and steady as she replied, "I'm training. I come here for the quiet. That's all." Moore studied her for a moment, her sharp eyes flicking back to Stevens, who was now shifting uncomfortably. "Training," she repeated. "In an abandoned warehouse at night." Tasha nodded. "Yes, it's private, and I'm not disturbing anyone. At least I wasn't until Officer Stevens showed up." The subtle jab wasn't lost on Moore, who raised an eyebrow and turned back to Stevens. "And what prompted you to escalate this to a call for backup?" she asked, her tone pointed. Stevens's jaw tightened, his face flushing. "She was being uncooperative," he muttered. "Refused to leave when I told her to." Moore crossed her arms, her sharp gaze boring into him. "Uncooperative how? Did she threaten you? Was she aggressive?" Stevens hesitated, the question hanging in the air like a loaded gun. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, waiting for his response. His pride warred with the reality of the situation, and for a moment he considered doubling down, painting Tasha as a threat. But the weight of her earlier words lingered in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. "No," he admitted finally, his voice low. "She wasn't aggressive." Moore's expression darkened, her jaw tightening as she glanced between him and Tasha. "So let me get this straight," she said slowly, her voice laced with barely concealed irritation. "You called for backup because a woman was training." Stevens bristled, his pride flaring. "She was acting suspicious," he said defensively. "This isn't exactly a safe area. Neither is a donut shop after midnight." Moore shot back, her patience thinning. "But we don't call in half the precinct for someone sitting at a counter." The two younger officers exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable as they stood near the entrance. Tasha remained silent, her calm presence a stark contrast to the storm brewing within Stevens. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was unfolding on its own. Moore turned back to Tasha, her tone softening slightly. "Ma'am, do you have any ID on you?" Tasha nodded, pulling a small wallet from her pocket and handing over her driver's license. Moore glanced at it, her eyes flicking over the details before handing it back. "Thank you," she said. "And for the record, you're not under arrest. This seems like a misunderstanding." Stevens's face reddened further, and he stepped forward, his voice rising. "Misunderstanding. She was trespassing. And yet she's standing here calmly." Moore interrupted, her tone icy. "No signs of aggression, no crime committed. If this is about trespassing, Stevens, why didn't you issue a warning and move on?" Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no words. The anger that had fueled him earlier was now a heavy stone in his chest, dragging him down with every second of Moore's scrutiny. Moore sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Listen, Stevens," she said, her tone sharp but not unkind. "You need to think long and hard about how you handle situations like this. We're here to protect and serve, not to escalate every interaction into a confrontation." Her words hit Stevens like a slap, and he looked away, his jaw clenched tight. Tasha, for her part, remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched the scene unfold. Moore turned back to Tasha. "I'm sorry for the trouble, ma'am," she said. "You're free to go, but I'd recommend finding a safer place to train. This area can be unpredictable." Tasha nodded, her gaze briefly flicking to Stevens. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said, "and I appreciate your professionalism." Moore gave a curt nod, then motioned for her officers to step back toward the door. Stevens lingered for a moment, his pride warring with the humiliation simmering in his chest. He avoided Tasha's gaze, unable to meet her eyes. As the officers filed out of the warehouse, Tasha stood alone once again. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing as the sound of their footsteps faded. She had faced worse than Stevens before, but something about this encounter lingered in her mind. A reminder of the fragility of power and the strength it took to stand against it. Outside, Stevens leaned against his patrol car, his hand shaking slightly as he stared at the ground. The reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him raw and exposed. He wasn't the hero of this story. He wasn't even the victim. He was just a man who had let his insecurities guide his actions, and now he had to live with the consequences. And as the sirens faded into the distance, Tasha walked away from the warehouse, her steps steady and sure. She had faced the storm and come out stronger, her quiet strength a testament to the power of resilience in the face of oppression. The reckoning. Tasha exited the warehouse with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the ordeal. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she stepped onto the cracked pavement. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the scene, casting stark shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the empty street. Sergeant Moore watched her leave, her expression thoughtful. As the younger officers packed up, murmuring quietly amongst themselves, Moore approached Stevens, who was still leaning against his patrol car, his hands gripping the edge of the hood like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Walk with me, Stevens," Moore said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He straightened reluctantly, falling into step beside her as she led him a few paces away from the others. The sound of their boots against the asphalt echoed in the stillness of the night. When they stopped, Moore turned to face him, her sharp gaze cutting through the layers of anger and shame he was trying to bury. "What the hell was that back there?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. Stevens shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away. "She was being defiant," he muttered. "She wouldn't listen, and she challenged me." Moore's brow furrowed, her frustration evident. "Challenged you? How exactly?" "By standing her ground. By refusing to cower, because you decided she didn't belong there." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off. "Listen to me, Stevens," she said, her tone sharpening. "I don't know what you were trying to prove in there, but it wasn't about enforcing the law. It was about your ego. And let me make one thing very clear. Your badge doesn't give you the right to harass people just because they don't fit your narrative." Her words hit him like a hammer, each one driving home the truth he had been avoiding. He clenched his jaw, his pride warring with the gnawing sense of guilt that was creeping in. "She was trespassing," he said weakly, grasping at the only defense he could muster. "And you had every opportunity to handle that without escalating it into a spectacle," Moore shot back. "But you didn't, did you? You let it get personal. You let her see your insecurities, and instead of backing down, you doubled down." Stevens's face flushed with anger and shame, but he didn't respond. What could he say? Everything Moore was saying was true, and deep down, he knew it. Moore sighed, her frustration softening into something closer to disappointment. "Look, Stevens," she said, her voice quieter now. "I get it. This job can mess with your head. It can make you feel like you have to be in control all the time, like any challenge to your authority is a threat. But you can't let that mindset dictate how you treat people, because when you do, you stop being a protector and start becoming a bully." The word hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Stevens flinched, the truth of it cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who upheld the law and kept the peace. But tonight, he had crossed a line, and there was no denying it. Moore took a step closer, her voice softening further. "You've got a choice to make, Stevens. You can keep letting your pride and your anger control you, or you can learn from this. But if you don't figure it out soon, you're going to end up on the wrong side of this badge. And when that happens, no one's going to be there to back you up." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the quiet aftermath of her words. Meanwhile, Tasha walked briskly down the empty street, her mind replaying the events of the night. She had faced men like Stevens before, men who let their insecurities manifest as aggression, who used their authority to mask their own fears. But something about this encounter felt different. She could see the cracks in Stevens's armor, the vulnerability he was so desperate to hide. And for a brief moment, she had felt something akin to pity for him. But pity wasn't enough to excuse his behavior. She had learned long ago that standing up for herself, even when it was exhausting, was the only way to survive in a world that often seemed determined to tear her down. Tonight had been another battle in a lifelong war, and though she had emerged unscathed, the weight of it lingered. As she reached her car, parked a few blocks away, Tasha took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She wasn't sure what Stevens would take away from their encounter, if anything. But she hoped, for his sake, and for others he might encounter, that he would reflect on what had happened. Sliding into the driver's seat, she glanced in the rearview mirror, her own reflection staring back at her. She was tired but resolute, the fire in her eyes undimmed. Turning the key, the engine roared to life, and she drove off into the night, leaving the warehouse and the confrontation behind. Back at the scene, Stevens remained rooted in place, staring at the empty warehouse. The flashing lights of the patrol cars illuminated his face, highlighting the conflict etched into his features. Moore's words echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. Bully. The word clung to him, a label he didn't want but couldn't shake. As the other officers began to pack up, he stayed where he was, his mind racing with questions he didn't know how to answer. Who was he, really? A protector? A man of the law? Or just another insecure figure hiding behind a badge? The sirens faded, the lights dimmed, and the night swallowed him whole. Redemption or ruin? The morning light spilled through the cracks in the blinds of Officer Stevens's small apartment. He sat at his dining table, a mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. He hadn't slept. The events of the previous night churned in his mind like a storm he couldn't escape. Every word Tasha had said, every look she had given him, replayed over and over. Her calm confidence, her refusal to submit, the way she had stood her ground even as he tried to tear her down. It wasn't just her defiance that haunted him. It was the truth in her words. She had seen through him, stripped away the layers of authority and bravado he wore like armor and left him exposed. Vulnerable. Bully. Sergeant Moore's words rang louder than any siren. It was a label he had never associated with himself, but now he couldn't deny how it fit. The reflection staring back at him in the darkened screen of his phone didn't look like the man he thought he was. It looked like the man he had become. Angry, insecure, desperate for control. The shrill ring of his phone jolted him from his thoughts. He hesitated before answering, the caller ID showing Moore's name. He knew this wasn't a social call. "Stevens," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Morning," Moore said, her tone clipped. "We need to talk. Meet me at the precinct in an hour." Before he could respond, she hung up. Stevens sighed heavily, setting the phone down and staring into the swirling black surface of his coffee. An hour. Enough time to decide whether he was going to defend his actions or finally face the truth. At the precinct, the air was charged with the hum of routine activity. Phones ringing, officers chatting, and the distant sound of typing filling the space. Stevens walked through the bullpen with his shoulders tense, avoiding eye contact with his colleagues. He felt like every gaze lingered a second too long, like everyone knew what had happened the night before. Moore was waiting for him in one of the small conference rooms. She stood by the window, her arms crossed, the faint light highlighting the streaks of gray in her hair. When Stevens entered, she turned, her expression unreadable. "Close the door," she said. He obeyed, the soft click of the latch sealing the room in tense silence. Moore gestured to a chair, and he sat, his back stiff, his hands resting on his knees. "What happened last night?" Moore began, her voice low and steady. Stevens hesitated, his mouth dry. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but the weight of her gaze pinned him in place. For the first time, he felt the futility of excuses. I let it get personal," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Moore nodded slowly, her expression softening just enough to show she appreciated the honesty. "Why?" He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know." She was just so calm, like she wasn't afraid of me, like she thought she was better than me. "And that bothered you?" Moore asked, her tone free of judgment, but pointed enough to make him squirm. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "It did, because I didn't know how to deal with it. I wanted to control the situation, and when I couldn't, He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "You escalated," Moore said, completing the thought for him. "You let your pride and your insecurity drive your actions instead of your training." Stevens nodded reluctantly, the truth of her words cutting deep. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said, his voice small. I don't know." Moore sighed, leaning against the edge of the table. "Stevens, you've been with us for years. I've seen you handle situations with grace and professionalism. But something's changed. You're carrying something. Anger, frustration, whatever it is. And it's bleeding into your work." Stevens looked away, ashamed. "I don't know how to fix it." Moore's expression softened further. "The first step is admitting there's a problem. You've done that. Now you need to do the work. Counseling, retraining, whatever it takes to get your head right. Because if you don't, this job will eat you alive." He nodded slowly, her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "What happens now?" Moore straightened, her tone firm. "There's going to be an internal review of what happened last night. You'll likely face some disciplinary action. Maybe suspension, maybe worse. But what you do with this moment is up to you. You can let it break you, or you can use it to become better." The thought of suspension, of the humiliation it would bring, twisted in his gut. But deep down, he knew it was deserved. He had crossed a line, and there were consequences for that. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Moore nodded, her gaze steady. "Don't thank me yet. You've got a long way to go." Across town, Tasha sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea as the morning sun streamed through the windows. She had slept soundly, her body and mind at ease after the confrontation. She didn't often dwell on encounters like the one with Stevens, but this one lingered in her thoughts. She had seen something in him, something broken but not beyond repair. It was rare to see a man like Stevens hesitate, to see the cracks in their armor. She had pushed him, forced him to face his own reflection, and she wondered if he would have the courage to confront what he saw. Her phone buzzed, a message from her closest friend appearing on the screen. "You okay after last night? Want to talk?" Tasha smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "I'm fine. Just another night of standing my ground. Let's grab lunch soon." As she set the phone down, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She hadn't just survived the confrontation. She had stood firm in the face of intimidation, refused to shrink, and walked away with her dignity intact. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had planted a seed of change in a man who desperately needed it. Whether that seed would grow was up to him. The world outside buzzed with life, and Tasha rose from her chair, ready to face another day. She knew there would be more battles, more moments that tested her resolve. But she also knew that she was ready, stronger than fear, stronger than hate, stronger than anything that sought to diminish her. Because that was who she was, and no one could take that from her. The turning point. Tasha stepped out onto her small balcony, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs. The sun was climbing higher, casting a warm glow over the city below. She sipped her tea, her mind drifting back to the confrontation in the warehouse. She didn't feel anger or resentment, just a quiet sense of resolve. She had faced worse in her life, but there was something about Stevens that lingered in her thoughts. Maybe it was the way he faltered, the way his anger seemed to mask something deeper. Men like him didn't often show cracks in their armor, but when they did, it revealed a fragility they fought desperately to hide. Tasha didn't pity him, but she couldn't ignore the humanity she glimpsed beneath his bravado. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. A notification lit up the screen. News alert. Local officer under investigation after warehouse incident. Curious, she clicked the link. The article was short, detailing an internal review into Stevens's conduct during the previous night's encounter. It didn't mention her by name, but the description was unmistakable. She stared at the screen, her emotions a mix of vindication and unease. She had stood her ground, and now it seemed her actions might lead to consequences for Stevens. But what would those consequences be? Would they force him to confront his behavior, or would they push him deeper into the anger and resentment that had driven him to act the way he did? Tasha sighed, setting the phone down. She couldn't control what happened to Stevens. All she could do was continue to live her life with the same strength and dignity that had carried her through so much already. At the precinct, Stevens sat in a small, sterile office, the blinds drawn to block out the midday sun. Across from him sat an internal affairs investigator, a stern woman with sharp features and piercing eyes. A recorder sat on the desk between them, its red light glowing steadily as she asked questions in a calm, measured tone. Officer Stevens, do you feel your actions last night were justified? Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wanted to defend himself, to argue that he had been doing his job, but the words felt hollow even before they left his mouth. Instead, he hesitated, his mind replaying the moment Tasha had looked him in the eye and told him he was better than this. No, he admitted finally, his voice quiet. They weren't. The investigator raised an eyebrow, surprised by his candor. Can you elaborate? Stevens took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. I let my frustration get the better of me, he said. She wasn't doing anything wrong, but I escalated the situation because I felt like I needed to prove something. I wanted control, and when I didn't get it, I pushed too far. The confession hung in the air, raw and unvarnished. The investigator nodded, making notes on her tablet. Do you understand the seriousness of your actions? She asked. Yes, Stevens said, his voice steadier now. I know I crossed a line. I know I need to do better. The investigator regarded him for a long moment, then turned off the recorder. Thank you for your honesty, she said. The review will continue, and disciplinary action will be determined. In the meantime, you're on administrative leave. Use this time wisely, Officer Stevens. He nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. As he left the office, the bustling precinct felt distant, the noise muffled by the thoughts swirling in his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of determination to change. Weeks later, on a quiet afternoon, Tasha was sitting in a local park, her journal open on her lap. She often came here to reflect, to write, and to find peace in the midst of the city's chaos. The sound of children playing and the rustle of leaves in the breeze provided a soothing backdrop as she wrote. She didn't notice Stevens approaching until he was a few feet away. When she looked up, her expression was calm but wary. He stood there in plain clothes, his hands shoved into his pockets, his posture uncertain. Ms. Owens, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Tasha closed her journal, studying him for a moment before nodding. Officer Stevens. Not for now, he said with a faint, rueful smile. I'm on leave. Tasha arched an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out slowly, as if they were difficult to say but necessary. I was out of line that night. You didn't deserve any of it. Tasha regarded him carefully, her sharp eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity there, the weight of the words he had carried with him since that night. After a long pause, she nodded. Thank you, she said simply. Stevens hesitated, then sat on the bench a respectful distance away. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he admitted. About control and pride and who I've been. You were right. I let myself become someone I don't want to be. Tasha didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle. Finally, she said, acknowledging it is the first step. What you do next is what matters. He nodded, her words hitting him with the same weight they had in the warehouse. I'm working on it, he said. I don't know if I'll get it right, but I'm trying. Tasha smiled faintly, her expression softening. That's all anyone can do. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. When Stevens finally stood to leave, he turned to her one last time. Thank you, he said, for standing your ground, for not letting me push you. You taught me something that night. Tasha nodded, her gaze steady. Good luck, Stevens. As he walked away, she opened her journal again, her pen moving across the page with a newfound sense of clarity. She didn't know where his path would take him, but she hoped he would find a better version of himself along the way. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that strength wasn't just about standing tall. It was about finding the courage to change. And in her own quiet way, she had given Stevens the opportunity to do just that. The wind rustled the pages of her journal, and Tasha smiled, turning her face to the sun. The world was full of battles, but this one had ended not with victory or defeat, but with the possibility of redemption. And that, she thought, was worth fighting for.